Hello everyone. If your day has been loud, let this be the quiet after the storm. Set down what you carried here. Breathe in, slowly, and let it go. Tonight, we won't chase noise or urgency. We'll move like candlelight across a dark room. Soft, unhurried, kind. Listen for small things. The hush of a corridor, distant footsteps fading, the gentle turn of a hidden page. You are safe here. Nothing asks for effort. Nothing expects more than your breathing. Where are you listening from tonight? A small town, a city window, a quiet room with the lights low? Tell me in the comments. And if this gentle kind of history helps you rest, you can subscribe and return whenever the night feels heavy. Close your eyes. Feel the room loosen around you. A door opens toward another time. Not brighter, just calmer, and together we step through, slowly, like water finding its level. Now, let the story begin to find you. Rome was already weary when the boy was born. Its streets were carved from marble, its forums filled with voices, yet something inside the city trembled a quiet exhaustion, like an empire breathing through cracked lips. The Republic was old, proud, and fraying at the seams. Senators debated ideals no one believed in anymore. Soldiers carried the weight of endless wars, and merchants whispered that even the gods seemed tired of watching. It was into that fragile moment that Gaius Octavius entered the world, on a morning washed pale with sunlight. He came not with the cry of a conqueror, but with a thin, uncertain breath. His mother, Atia, wrapped him in linen and held him to her heart, as if afraid the small warmth might flicker out. The midwives murmured about his weakness, his frail limbs, his grayish skin. One said quietly that he might not see another winter, but the child endured quietly, stubbornly, as though life itself clung to him out of curiosity. When he was only 4, death visited again. His father, also named Gaius Octavius, passed away suddenly while serving in the provinces. Rome barely noticed. Such things happened every day in the machinery of empire. But in a modest villa outside the city, grief lingered in softer ways. The boy was taken in by his grandmother, Julia Minor, the sister of Julius Caesar. She was wise and watchful, with the patience of someone who had seen too many storms pass through the same sky. From her, Octavian learned the virtue of stillness. She taught him that survival in Rome did not always mean being the strongest or the loudest. It meant waiting, understanding, and remembering. In the evenings, she told him stories of his great-uncle Caesar, who was already rising in glory, stories of campaigns in Gaul, of brilliant speeches in the Forum, of ambition that could swallow worlds. But for the boy, Caesar was more myth than man, a constellation burning far beyond reach. Octavian's own world was small, the villa garden with its cypress trees, the scent of parchment and olive oil, the distant hum of the city. His body remained fragile. He was often confined to bed with fevers, his breath thin as silk. He would lie awake through the night, tracing shadows on the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his grandmother's prayers from the next room. Those nights were long and quiet, yet inside them, something was being formed, a patience deeper than pain, a kind of quiet fire. When he was well enough, he studied letters, history, philosophy. He read everything within reach. His tutors often said he absorbed words like a sponge absorbs water, silently, completely, without showing much emotion. He didn't compete for praise. He simply learned. There was a serenity to his focus that unsettled even his elders. And then there was Marcus Agrippa, a boy his age, strong where Octavian was weak, quick where he was cautious. They met during their early schooling. Agrippa was the sort who wrestled and laughed, who leapt into rivers without hesitation. Octavian was the one who watched, who waited to understand the shape of things before stepping forward. Their friendship was unlikely, but deep. Agrippa defended the sickly boy from bullies. Octavian, in turn, offered something rarer: insight, steadiness, the ability to see several steps ahead. Years later, Agrippa would command armies in Octavian's name, build monuments that still stand in Rome. But in those early days, they were simply boys, one running, one coughing softly in his wake, both dreaming of something they couldn't yet name. Outside, Rome was shifting. Caesar's name grew heavier in the air. The Senate whispered. Rival generals sharpened ambition into knives. The Republic that had stood for centuries was beginning to shudder beneath the weight of its own victories. But none of that mattered yet to the boy in the quiet house on the hill. His world was made of smaller sounds: the scrape of a quill, the chirp of cicadas, the low voice of his grandmother telling him that patience could be a kind of power. He grew older, still frail but sharper now, his eyes deep-set and thoughtful. When he walked through the forum beside his mother, people would turn to look not because of his strength or beauty, but because of the strange calm that surrounded him, like a lamp burning behind frosted glass. At night, when the city dimmed and torches flickered along the Tiber, he would climb to the roof and look toward the Capitoline Hill. There, beneath the constellations, he whispered small promises no one else would ever hear. He did not dream of conquest or crowns, not yet. His thoughts were quieter, that he would not be forgotten, that his weakness would not define him, that someday he might understand why the world demanded so much of those who were gentle. Rome around him was restless, loud, desperate to stay alive, but Octavian's soul was the opposite, measured, still, waiting for its moment to speak. No one, not his tutors, not his mother, not even the sharp-eyed Caesar who occasionally inquired after his nephew, could have imagined what time was preparing inside that fragile frame. The boy who trembled with fever, who coughed through his lessons and spoke only when certain of his words, would one day bend the entire Roman world into his design. But that future slept far away. For now, the boy was only learning to breathe through the weight of his own lungs. He would remember those early nights, the cool linen sheets, the scent of burning oil, the sound of distant footsteps in marble halls. He would remember the stillness, the helplessness, the longing to rise and join the world beyond the window. Because before he ruled men, he learned how to wait. Before he held power, he learned how to hold pain without breaking. And before Rome became his empire, he learned how to listen to his breath, to silence, to time itself. In the heart of a fading republic, where senators schemed and armies clashed, there lay a small boy with eyes like winter light, weak in body, unyielding in spirit. He did not yet know that he would one day become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. For now, he simply existed, quiet as dawn, fragile as hope, breathing softly in a city that did not yet know his name. The years passed quietly, as Rome grew louder around him. By the time Octavian reached his early teens, the Republic was trembling beneath the weight of ambition. Julius Caesar's name was on every tongue, spoken with awe, envy, or fear. He was a storm walking in daylight, reshaping everything he touched. But for the boy watching from afar, he was still only a silhouette, a rumor that glowed faintly through the dust of history in motion. Sometimes, when messengers from the city came to Julia Minor's villa, they brought stories of his triumphs. Caesar crossing the Alps in winter, Caesar riding through Gaul, the standards glittering behind him. Caesar's speeches that could quiet entire forums, turning enemies into admirers. To Octavian, these were bedtime tales, but not ones of comfort. They carried a strange, heavy gravity, like listening to the heartbeat of the world. He saw his great-uncle only rarely, When Caesar visited the family estate, he filled the rooms like a tide, bringing laughter, gold, and the subtle tension that follows power. Octavian, pale and thin, would stand near the doorway, too shy to speak. He would study the way Caesar's hands moved when he gestured, the way men older than him leaned forward to listen, afraid to miss a word. To everyone else, Caesar was the Sunday. To Octavian, he was the shadow the sun cast, a measure of what might be possible. At night, after such visits, Octavian would sit by a dying lamp, tracing figures in the wax pooled beneath it. He didn't yet understand what he was seeing, but something inside him stirred. Not envy, not even ambition, but a quiet fascination with order. Caesar seemed to carry the pattern of the world within him, bending chaos into design. And though the boy did not yet know it, the same impulse to bring stillness where there was noise was already being born in him. Then came the day of Julia Minor's death, in the year 51 BC. Octavian was chosen to deliver her funeral oration, a rare honor for someone so young. The family gathered in the atrium, veiled women in mourning white, men standing solemn with their right hands pressed to their chests. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent to their loss. When he rose to speak, the scroll trembled slightly in his hand. He was not strong enough to project his voice across a crowd, yet those closest said that his words carried in a different way, soft, clear, unwavering. He spoke of his grandmother's kindness, her patience, her faith in Rome. And though the ceremony was private, whispers of the boy's composure reached farther than anyone expected. Even Caesar heard. In those words, people said later, they glimpsed something of the uncle, the same measured tone, the same sense of purpose, but without the arrogance. It was a reflection of light upon still water, quiet yet undeniable. From that moment, Caesar began to take more notice. He arranged for Octavian to be admitted into the College of Pontifices, one of Rome's sacred priestly boards, a title of prestige for a youth barely entering manhood. It was mostly ceremonial, yet it placed him within the fabric of power, like a single thread, stitched into a vast and ancient tapestry. To outsiders, it seemed a gesture of affection, an uncle helping a frail relative find purpose. But in Caesar's mind, perhaps there was something more. He had begun to sense that the republic he served was dying, that the storm of civil war was only waiting for its hour. And somewhere in that awareness, the image of a calm, clever, and unthreatening boy may have seemed like a seed worth planting. Octavian did not see it that way. He accepted the honor with quiet gratitude, performing the rites, learning the chants, bowing before the altars of the gods, whose marble faces never changed. But deep down, he was watching not the gods, not the ceremonies, but the men around them, how influence flowed, invisible but constant, how words, once spoken softly, could move armies. He began to understand that Rome was not ruled by strength alone. It was ruled by rhythm, by the pauses between words, by who waited longest, by who seemed the least eager. Sometimes, he imagined Caesar at the Senate, surrounded by rivals smiling through their teeth. He wondered how it felt to hold such weight and still stand unbent. And though he would not admit it, he began to mirror the same small gestures, the calm expression, the slow turn of the head, the habit of speaking less than he knew. In time, it became natural to him, as if imitation were a kind of inheritance. The years between boyhood and manhood slipped quietly past. Rome grew louder still. There were riots in the streets, rumors of conspiracies, debts, betrayals, and victories so grand they felt unreal. But Octavian remained mostly in the background, a young man of quiet health and quieter habits. His mother worried that he lacked passion. His teachers whispered that he might lack heart. They did not understand that stillness, for him, was a form of strength. Every visit from Caesar was brief and thunderous. He came, spoke, and vanished like a passing god. But each time, he left a trace, a new understanding of how power could move without violence, how charm could become a weapon sharper than any sword. On one such visit, Caesar clasped the boy's shoulder and told him to continue his studies. His words were simple, almost distracted, but they stayed with Octavian for years. There was warmth in the gesture, yet beneath it, a warning, as if the older man already sensed the world was shifting toward its next generation. And so the boy watched from the threshold, as empires so often begin, not with battle, but with observation. In the flicker of torchlight, he learned the shape of greatness from its shadow. He learned that the future often hides in silence, waiting, listening, learning when not to speak. While Caesar's triumphs thundered across the Republic, the boy he barely noticed was becoming the mirror that would outlast him. For every blaze leaves behind a reflection quieter, steadier, destined to burn longer. The river that changed everything was small, so narrow that a single stone could almost bridge it. Yet when Caesar's army crossed the Rubicon, it felt as though the world itself had been divided. Rome, once whole, had split into two hearts beating against each other. In the city, the air thickened with fear. Senators whispered in corridors, families packed their treasures, and the sound of sandals striking marble carried the weight of destiny. The Republic, that delicate balance of pride and law, trembled on its foundations. Octavian was 16, still thin, still pale, but no longer a child. The fever that had haunted his early years had left him quieter, but also sharper, like metal cooled after fire. He watched the world shift around him, the old names of Rome turning into sides, friends becoming enemies overnight. His great-uncle, Caesar, was marching home with legions at his back. Pompey the Great, once his ally, now stood against him. From afar, Octavian followed every word, every rumor. To most of Rome, it was another power struggle, one of many. But to him, it was something more. It was the moment when history began to walk beside him, whispering, "Are you watching? This is how empires die, and how they are born." When Caesar entered Italy, crossing that forbidden stream, it was said that he paused only once, looking down at the current and murmuring, "The die is cast." Octavian imagined the scene, often the quiet rush of water, the heavy breath of soldiers, the single man stepping forward into fate. It was an image that would never leave him. Soon after, the civil war began to consume everything. Rome's streets filled with soldiers, banners, and hunger. Families divided, loyalties tore, and the city that had once ruled the world became its own battlefield of whispers. Caesar's victories came quickly, first in Italy, then across Greece and Egypt. Pompey fell, and the Senate fled or bowed. To most, Caesar was now a god made flesh. To Octavian, he was both a beacon and a question. What kind of courage did it take to command so much destruction and still walk calmly through it? The boy longed to follow him, to prove that his own blood carried something of that same iron. But Caesar thought him too fragile for war. "Rest," the great man had said. "There will be other battles." Octavian obeyed, for a time. Yet obedience never came easily to him when purpose called. In 45 BC, Caesar prepared for another campaign, this time against Pompey's sons in Hispania. Octavian, though still unwell, begged to join him. The request was denied. His body was weak, his lungs easily tired, and the journey would be long and brutal. Caesar loved him in a distant, practical way, the kind that cared more for survival than sentiment. So the boy watched the army depart without him. He watched the banners vanish into the horizon, the dust rise, the sound of trumpets fade. And then, when the world grew quiet again, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would go anyway. He rose from his sickbed, still trembling from fever, and summoned what little strength remained. Servants protested. His mother wept, but he refused to yield. "If I die," he said softly, "then at least it will not be from fear." The journey was long and cruel. The wind off the mountains tore through his cloak. Rain soaked him until he shivered uncontrollably, and more than once his horse stumbled beneath him. But Octavian pressed on a solitary figure, moving through lands that had already tasted war. He coughed blood into his sleeve and rode harder. Somewhere ahead, Caesar was fighting the last ghosts of the Republic. When he finally reached the camp in Spain, the war was nearly done. Caesar's banners flew victorious above the plain. The old general, surprised to see the boy, listened in silence as Octavian explained how he had crossed Italy alone, despite illness and exhaustion, to stand at his side. Caesar's expression softened. He could have scolded him, and perhaps another man would have, but instead, he placed a hand on Octavian's shoulder and said, "You came when you did not need to. That is what courage looks like." Later, as the soldiers feasted, Caesar told the story to his officers. They laughed, not unkindly, at the stubborn youth who had defied sickness to join a war that was already won. But in his tone, there was pride. He saw in the boy not strength of body, but strength of will, and in Rome, that was rarer. For Octavian, that single gesture meant more than any triumph. He had proven something, not to Caesar, but to himself, that endurance could be its own kind of power. The journey home was gentler. He rode beside his uncle's entourage, listening to the talk of generals and statesmen. He said little, but absorbed everything. How they spoke of loyalty and treachery, how they measured victory in patience as much as blood. In the evenings, he sat by the campfire and watched the sparks drift upward into the dark. Each spark seemed like a small life, bright, brief, and gone. The faces of the soldiers glowed in the flickering light, men who would die nameless, but whose endurance made history possible. Something inside him shifted then. He realized that glory was only a surface. Beneath it, power was built from smaller, quieter things. Resolve, timing, restraint, the patience of those who knew when to wait. When they finally returned to Rome, Octavian was still coughing, still frail but different. He walked slower, yet with more certainty. He had seen what ambition cost, and he carried its weight without complaint. The world would remember many victories, Caesar's conquests, his crown, his fall, but none of them began without moments like this one boy, alone, refusing to be left behind. The echo of the Rubicon was not just a river crossed in defiance. It was every step that followed, every life that dared to move forward despite weakness. For Octavian, it became a quiet law of existence, that courage need not roar. Sometimes, it only breathes faintly, stubbornly, and keeps walking. The spring air, in 44 BC, carried an unease that no one could name. Rome glittered, but beneath the marble and incense, something strained, invisible, and taut, like a bowstring pulled too long. Julius Caesar had returned from victory in Spain, crowned by triumphs, surrounded by loyal soldiers and trembling senators. The Republic bowed before him and whispered that it would never rise again. On the morning of the Ides of March, the Forum was restless. Clouds passed like veiled omens over the temples. People said the gods had sent warnings. Strange lights in the sky, horses refusing to eat, the sound of metal ringing where none was struck. Caesar laughed them away. "Danger," he said, "is for the next man." And so he walked into the Senate chamber. What happened there would echo for centuries. 23 blows, given quickly, each man eager not to be the last. The marble floor turned dark, and with Caesar's fall, the air seemed to collapse too. as if Rome itself had forgotten how to breathe. Far from the city, in Apollonia, Octavian was studying with his friend Agrippa. The two young men had spent the morning practicing tactics along the coast when a messenger arrived, dust-covered, silent. In his trembling hands was the news that would change the world. "Your great-uncle," the man said, "is dead." Octavian said nothing at first. He stared past the messenger, past the sea, into a silence so deep it felt like the horizon itself had stopped moving. The words didn't make sense. Caesar, the immovable, the immortal gone, the man who had walked through civil wars as through smoke. Agrippa spoke softly, urging him to flee. "They will kill his heir next," he said. Others agreed. The city was boiling with chaos. Caesar's allies were in hiding. His killers were celebrated in the streets. But Octavian did not move. That night, he sat awake beneath the flickering oil lamp, hearing the sea breathe against the shore. He was 19, thin and fever-scarred, but something in his chest had gone still. Not fear, not even grief, but clarity. For the first time, the path before him was visible, though it glowed faintly and led into darkness. Days later, another messenger arrived from Rome, carrying a copy of Caesar's will. It was read aloud before a small circle of witnesses. Inside that document, written in Caesar's own hand, lay the seed of empire. The testament declared that Gaius Octavius was to be adopted posthumously as Caesar's son and heir to nearly all his fortune. It was as if thunder had been trapped on parchment. For Mark Antony, Caesar's former lieutenant, now standing at the center of power, the revelation was a blow he could not hide. The inheritance should have been his, or at least shared among the generals who had shed blood for the dictator. Instead, it was given to a frail youth studying philosophy across the sea. Rome reeled. Some saw destiny, others a farce. But for Octavian, the will was not a prize, it was a command. He read and reread the lines until the ink blurred. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "He calls me son." The words sounded fragile, but beneath them something unbreakable began to form a promise that the dead man's work would not die with him. Against all counsel, Octavian decided to return to Rome. Agrippa tried to stop him. His mother begged him to stay. The roads were unsafe, the Senate divided, and Antony already grasping for control. Yet the young man only said, "If I am his son, then Rome will see it." He sailed north across the Adriatic under low clouds. The journey was rough. Wind tore the sails, rain lashed the deck, and the crew feared pursuit. But Octavian stood on the prow through the night, face pale and still. Somewhere behind him lay the safety of childhood. Ahead waited the city that had devoured his uncle, and would soon test him too. When he arrived, Rome was a fever dream. Statues of Caesar were draped in black. The forum smelled of wax and smoke. At night, torches lined the streets where mobs chanted his name, Caesar, 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 while others called the assassins liberators. The Republic was tearing itself in two. Antony moved quickly, giving fiery speeches at Caesar's funeral, showing the blood-stained robe, turning grief into rage. The crowd erupted, dragging the conspirators' homes to ruin. Antony ruled the moment, but not the future. He had the voice, the veterans, the favor of the streets, yet he did not have the calm of the boy who was watching him. Octavian stood in the crowd that day, his hood drawn low. He watched the pyre blaze, the smoke rising like a column of shadow. Around him, people wept, screamed, swore vengeance. He did none of these things. He only whispered, "It isn't over." And, later that night, he climbed the Palatine Hill, looking over the flickering city. The wind smelled of ashes and wine. In his hand, he still held a small scroll, the copy of Caesar's will, creased from being read too many times. He thought of the years ahead, of Antony's strength, of the Senate's cunning, of the weight of the name he now carried. He was 19 and felt older than the moon. The city before him was broken, but alive, and somehow it already seemed to recognize him. In that quiet hour, Rome did not need another soldier. It needed a listener, a thinker, someone who could outlast storms by standing still. The boy who had once lain sick beneath his grandmother's watch now stood beneath the stars, holding the future of the world in trembling hands. He had not asked for it, yet it had come. The night of Caesar's death ended one world and began another, a world where silence could be sharper than swords and patience more dangerous than power. Octavian breathed once, deeply, as if accepting both burden and blessing. Somewhere, far below, the embers of Caesar's pyre hissed and cooled. In their fading light, a new flame began to rise. Rome had seen chaos before: fires, riots, assassinations, but not this kind of unease. The city after Caesar's death was neither at war nor at peace. It was holding its breath. In the Forum, statues of the old heroes stared down at a people who no longer knew which side of history they stood on. Into this tense air walked Gaius Octavian, 19 years old, slight, pale, unarmed. His arrival drew little notice at first. The senators saw only a boy from a distant family estate. The veterans saw no general scars upon him. Yet there was something in his stillness that unsettled even the loudest men. A calm, so complete it felt deliberate. He moved through the streets with quiet certainty, stopping to greet soldiers who had once served under Caesar, listening more than he spoke. He did not shout vengeance or wave banners. Instead, he asked simple questions. Were you paid? Were you honored? And always he ended with the same line: Caesar loved his men. It was soft, but it landed like a promise. By the time he reached the Forum, whispers had begun to travel faster than he did. The heir has come. He had no army, no office, and barely enough gold to feed his household. But what he did have, what no one could yet measure, was focus. Mark Antony ruled the city in the weeks following Caesar's death, carrying himself like a man who believed the future already belonged to him. He presided over speeches, controlled the treasury, and claimed to defend Caesar's legacy. Yet his temper burned too easily. When challenged, he threatened. When questioned, he shouted. He had power, but not poise. Octavian watched, quietly taking note. He knew that Rome was too weary for another warlord. What it needed now was someone who could make violence sound like order, and so he played the opposite game: soft, where Antony was loud, patient, where Antony was impulsive. At night, in a small rented villa near the Palatine, he and Agrippa planned by lamplight. They had no generals to command, only letters to write and favors to win. Agrippa urged action to raise a private force, to seize the veterans before Antony could, but Octavian shook his head. Not yet, he said. Let him burn himself first. Beyond their walls, Cicero, the old orator and philosopher, was also watching. He had once stood against Caesar, then praised him, then condemned him again. Now, seeing Antony's arrogance, Cicero sensed another chance to shape history with his words. And in Octavian, he saw not a boy, but a tool, sharp, clean, and unblooded. Use his youth, Cicero told his friends. It will make him invisible until it's too late. He began to write a series of speeches, the Philippics lashing Antony as a drunkard, a tyrant in waiting, a new Catiline rising from Caesar's ashes. His words spread through Rome like sparks in dry grass. Each insult, each phrase, pushed Antony closer to isolation. And behind those words, like a quiet rhythm beneath the noise, moved Octavian. He visited the veterans who had fought for Caesar, men forgotten after years of service. He walked among their tents, offering handshakes and small sums from his own purse. When he spoke, he did not promise glory, only respect. He listened to their complaints about unpaid wages and whispered, "If I had the treasury, you would be honored already." Word spread. The boy who spoke gently began to gather loyalty, not through command, but through memory. By midsummer, Antony began to notice. He called Octavian to meet him, perhaps to test him, perhaps to frighten him. The two men stood face to face, the general and the youth, in a courtyard heavy with heat. Antony, broad and confident, tried charm first. "You are Caesar's son," he said. "Then stand with me, and I'll show you how to rule." Octavian bowed slightly. "I intend to," he said, "but I must first learn how." There was a pause, long, silent, dangerous. Antony smiled, but his eyes narrowed. The boy had answered without yielding, and that was new. Afterward, Antony laughed to his companions. "He is polite, but he will learn fear." Yet when he turned away, a trace of unease followed him. There was something unnervingly steady in those pale eyes, something that did not fit the body of a teenager. As the months turned, Octavian's circle grew. Agrippa recruited quietly among the legions in Campania, where veterans remembered Caesar's kindness. By autumn, several cohorts had pledged loyalty to the young heir, not through bribes, but through faith. Cicero, now emboldened, began to speak more openly in the Senate. He praised Octavian's restraint, calling him the hope of the Republic, though privately, he only meant to use him as a counterweight to Antony. He believed he could guide the boy, mold him, teach him the rhythm of power without blood. But Octavian listened to Cicero's praise the way one listens to a wind through marble halls. Pleasant, but passing. He understood the old man's game and let him play it. In time, both Antony and Cicero would learn that silence could be as sharp as speech. Through it all, Octavian moved slowly, like someone counting each breath in a crowded room. He avoided open confrontation, preferred persuasion over command, and spoke with a calm that unnerved every rival. When asked how he planned to face Antony's soldiers, he replied simply, "One man cannot fight an army, but an idea can." By the end of the year, the storm that had followed Caesar's death had begun to change direction. Antony's outbursts turned allies into critics, while Octavian's patience drew them in. He had not yet fought a single battle, yet the map of loyalty in Rome was quietly shifting toward him. At 19, he was learning the oldest truth of empire, that power is not seized, it is invited. And the invitation, whispered through a city that no longer trusted heroes, was taking shape behind his calm face. Each night, as the lamps dimmed and Agrippa drifted into sleep, Octavian remained awake, staring at the city below. Rome glittered, feverish and fragile. He thought of Caesar's words, of the river crossed, of the promise sealed in blood and ink. He whispered to the empty room, "He taught me how to win. Now I must learn how to wait." And the streets outside were filled with noise merchants, drunks, preachers, soldiers, yet somehow his voice, low and steady, seemed to move through them all. A calm face in a stormy forum, a breath held until the world was ready to listen. It began, as many terrible things do, with an agreement signed on an island. 3 men, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, met by a river's edge, their voices low, the air heavy with the scent of wet reeds and iron. They had come not as rivals, but as men too weary to keep fighting each other. Rome had bled too much, and now its peace would be written not in laws, but in names. The pact they made that autumn of 43 BC was called the Second Triumvirate. Its purpose was simple, to restore order and avenge Caesar's death. But what it truly created was a machine for cleansing cold, methodical and without mercy. Each man brought his demands, his fears, his enemies. Antony wanted the Republicans crushed. Octavian wanted legitimacy. Lepidus wanted survival. They sat together and made a list of those who would die so that Rome might live. It began as politics and ended as scripture. By nightfall, over 2,000 names were written in neat lines, each one a human life. Senators, equestrians, poets, merchants, scholars, anyone whose loyalty wavered, whose silence had ever sounded like doubt. The pen, in that moment, became sharper than the sword. Among the names, one glowed brightest: Marcus Tullius Cicero. He had once shaped Rome with words sharper than steel. His speeches had stirred crowds, his letters moved hearts. Yet now, those same words condemned him. Antony would not forgive the Philippics, nor the insults carved into public memory. Cicero, for all his eloquence, had forgotten one rule of survival. In times of blood, logic is a liability. When Octavian's hand hovered over Cicero's name, he hesitated. Some said he owed the old orator for the early support that had helped him rise. Others said his silence meant consent. History would never decide whether Octavian's pause came from pity or calculation, only that he did not stop the pen from moving. The orders spread quickly. Lists were posted in the forum, nailed to doors and temples. A man could read his own death between morning and noon. Bounty hunters scoured the streets, cutting down anyone named and taking heads as proof. Rome filled with the smell of smoke and waxed the scent of blood and bureaucracy. Cicero tried to flee south, toward the coast. For days, he rode through fields, once owned by the men he had defended in court. He stopped only to write letters to friends, to his brother, to the republic he still believed might wake from this nightmare. "If my death can bring peace," he wrote, "let it come quickly." One morning his carriage stopped by a grove of olive trees near Formiae. The assassins were waiting. Cicero stepped down, weary but unafraid. He lifted his chin and said, "Do your work well." They did, and with one stroke, the voice of the Republic was silenced. In Rome, his head and hands were nailed to the rostra, the speaking platform where he had once moved nations with words. The crowd stood in silence, not in horror, but in exhaustion. The light had gone out of their city, and no one had the strength to mourn aloud. That winter, the triumvirs divided what remained. Antony took the east, Octavian the west, Lepidus the scraps between. They ruled as one body, with 3 hearts beating out of rhythm. Yet their bond, for all its cruelty, was stable, at least for now. Still, not all their enemies were gone. Across the sea, the assassins Brutus and Cassius had raised legions of their own, claiming to fight for freedom. They held the East Macedonia, Syria, the ghost of the old republic. So, when spring came again, the triumvirs marched. The armies moved eastward, through fields scarred by years of war. The banners of Caesar's heirs fluttered in the wind, marked with his name and laurel. Octavian rode beside Antony, the two of them silent, each lost in his own thoughts. They spoke rarely now, their alliance more necessity than trust. At night, the soldiers made fires that glowed like 1,000 small suns across the plains. The air smelled of smoke and damp leather. From his tent, Octavian could hear the low hum of songs, men singing, not of victory, but of endurance. He thought of Cicero then, of his voice, of his final calm. The image lingered like candlelight after a prayer. For all his youth, Octavian understood something older than Rome itself, that the price of peace was never counted in gold or grain. It was counted in names, written neatly, one by one, until no one was left to speak them aloud. When they reached the plains of Philippi, the triumvirs found the assassins waiting. The air there was heavy and still, as if history itself was holding its breath. The last sons of the Republic faced the new masters of the world. and for a brief moment, all of Rome's ghosts seemed to stand between them. Before the battle, Octavian walked alone to the edge of the camp. The dawn was grey, and mist rose from the marshes. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Let this be the last blood." But history, as ever, was deaf to mercy. The war that began with one man's ambition would end with the silence of thousands. The fires in the distance flickered and died, and somewhere in the dark, a single name, Cicero, still seemed to echo, soft as breath, through the city that had forgotten how to listen. The plain of Philippi lay wide and grey beneath the autumn sky, a vast expanse of trampled wheat and weary men. Two armies faced each other there, each claiming to fight for Rome, each convinced that history would remember their courage. Yet when the wind passed across the field, it carried no songs of glory, only the smell of mud, iron, and fear. For Octavian, it was the first true war he had ever seen, not the stories of heroes or marble victories told in the forum, but the raw, slow suffering of men. Rows upon rows of soldiers, shivering beneath tarnished armor, whispered prayers into the soil. The young leader moved among them quietly, pale beneath his helmet, saying little. He had been sick again, forced to command from a litter, but even in illness, his presence steadied those around him. He was calm, unnervingly calm, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond this world. Across the plain stood Brutus and Cassius, the slayers of Caesar, their standards bright beneath a fading Sunday. They had called themselves liberators, defenders of the Republic, and yet now, surrounded by legions that no longer believed in liberty, they looked less like saviors and more like men out of time. The first clash came like thunder. Antony led the left wing, his voice booming through the din. Octavian's forces, weakened by illness, held the right. Dust and screams rose together, a single trembling sound that seemed to shake the heavens. For hours, neither side yielded. Spears broke, shields splintered, men vanished into the red haze of battle. When the storm finally settled, the ground was slick with rain and blood. Brutus's line had held, but Cassius's flank had faltered. He retreated toward the hills, believing wrongly that Brutus had fallen, and in that mistaken despair, he ordered his own slave to take his life. The war, however, was not done. 2 weeks later, the armies met again on the same scarred field. The dead of the first battle still lay, where they had fallen unburied, half shrouded in mist. Ravens circled. The air smelled of rot and memory. Octavian, weakened but resolute, rode slowly along his line. He did not promise triumph. He only said, "Let this be the last day Rome fights herself." His men, worn and hollow-eyed, nodded. Even they no longer wanted victory, only an ending. When the signal sounded, it was almost gentle. The clash that followed felt quieter than before, as though both sides were fighting through exhaustion more than hatred. Brutus's army wavered, then broke. Surrounded, he withdrew into a small grove at the edge of the battlefield. There, beneath the shade of an ancient oak, he asked a friend to hold his sword and ran upon it himself. Thus ended the dream of the Republic. When the news reached Octavian's tent, he did not cheer. He sat in silence for a long while, listening to the soft patter of rain on the canvas. Antony, triumphant and flushed, entered with the air of a man expecting celebration, but the young heir only looked up and said, "So it's over." Antony laughed. "Over? No, boy, it's begun. Rome is ours." "Oh." Octavian said nothing. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the faint, sour scent of the dead. He felt no joy, only release a long, tired exhale after years of holding breath. That night, as the soldiers drank and shouted around the fires, Octavian walked alone among the fallen. The torches cast small halos of light across the field, touching armor, faces, hands. Everywhere, the dead seemed to sleep in uneasy peace, men who had once dreamed of laws, of honor, of a Rome that no longer existed. He stopped beside one body, barely recognizable beneath the mud. Someone whispered that it might be Brutus. For a moment, Octavian just stood there, watching how the torchlight flickered across the stillness. Then, quietly, he said he loved Rome too. The words surprised even him. There was no mockery in them, no triumph, only an understanding that the world had changed hands, not souls. Both sides had wanted the same thing, a Rome that would endure. They had simply imagined it differently. By dawn, the mist rolled back across the plain, revealing what the night had hidden, the full measure of the cost. Horses lay like broken statues, armor rusted crimson, the earth itself wounded. A crow perched on a standard and called once before, flying off into the grey distance. The victors burned their dead first, then the enemies. The smoke rose together, blending into one long column, black, twisting, indivisible. Watching it, Octavian thought that this was the true symbol of their war. Not banners, not swords, but ashes that no wind could separate. The war was won, but the boy who had come to avenge his uncle was gone. In his place stood someone quieter, not yet the emperor the world would know, but already something colder, more patient, more enduring. Later, as evening fell, he walked to the edge of the camp. The horizon burned orange where the last fires smoldered. The sky above it was vast and empty. He spoke softly, as if to the air itself. "No more enemies," he said, "only Rome." But even then, he knew it was a lie. Victory, like dawn, only ever lasted a moment before the next shadow arrived. And so the boy who had crossed seas, written names, and watched ideals die in the mud, stood beneath that pale sky, feeling neither pride nor sorrow, only a deep, still quiet, like the world taking one long breath before sleep. The war had ended at Philippi, but peace did not come home with it. Rome, still trembling from its own exhaustion, began to wither under quieter enemies, hunger, fear, and the sea itself. In the years that followed, the Republic was no more than a memory whispered between crumbling columns. The city had become swollen with widows, veterans, and debt. Grain ships from Egypt and Sicily no longer arrived on time. The harbors were choked by a new power, Sextus Pompey, son of the great Pompey the Great, the ghost of a name long thought buried. From his base in Sicily, Sextus ruled the sea like a storm that refused to pass. His ships patrolled every route that fed Rome. Grain rotted in warehouses along the coast. The city's markets turned frantic. Bread vanished, and so did mercy. At first, Octavian believed the crisis would fade. He had survived worse war, betrayal, sickness. But starvation was an enemy that could not be reasoned with. By the second winter, the people began to riot. They tore open granaries, set fire to warehouses, and cursed his name in the streets. Even the marble walls of his house could not keep the sound away. He would sit awake through the night, hearing the city's hunger through its echoes, the low, dull roar of desperation. It was then that Agrippa came to him, calm as ever. The same friend who had once trained with him in Apollonia, who had ridden beside him through every uncertainty, now stood at his side again, older, steadier, with the patience of a man who had learned that loyalty was not a word but a habit. "Let me take the sea," Agrippa said. "Even storms must tire eventually." Octavian hesitated. The sea was no place for him, he had failed there before. His last attempt to challenge Sextus had ended in wreckage, the waves swallowing his fleet like a careless god. But he trusted Agrippa as he trusted his own breath. Together, they planned. The days turned slow, and grey maps spread over tables, small lights flickering across the parchment like distant fires. They spoke little of glory, more of endurance. Rome watched from behind its hunger. The once golden city now smelled of smoke and salt. Children dug through ashes for crumbs. And yet, beneath the despair, there was movement, quiet, patient movement. Agrippa began to build a new fleet, not on the open coast, but inland, within a network of hidden lakes near the coast of Campania. There, in secret, shipwrights worked day and night, shaping hulls, testing sails, drilling oarsmen. It was a strange miracle, a navy grown from silence. When the winds finally shifted and the ships were ready, Agrippa sailed. Octavian watched from the shore, the grey horizon blurring with mist. He said nothing, only raised a hand, not in command, but in hope. The sea did not welcome them kindly. Storms tore through the masts, lightning split the sky, and for a moment it seemed the gods themselves mocked Rome's hunger. But Agrippa pressed on. He fought not just Sextus's fleet, but the sea's own cruelty, wave against wave, storm against will. Days turned to weeks, and then, slowly, word began to drift back across the wind. Victories. Small at first, a harbor reclaimed, a blockade broken, a grain ship safely docked. Then larger ones, Sextus's ships scattered, his strongholds weakened, the horizon opening. When the first grain ships finally reached Rome again, the people lined the docks as if greeting ghosts. They cheered through tears, catching the smell of wheat in the air, the scent of life returning. In the Forum, the anger began to fade. Bread reappeared. The riots quieted. But Octavian did not celebrate. He knew how quickly love could turn to resentment again. He walked the same streets that had cursed his name, head bowed, his face calm as always. Agrippa returned months later, sunburned, salt-streaked, but alive. When he entered Octavian's villa, the younger man rose and embraced him without a word. For a moment, all the noise of Rome, the arguments, the debts, the restless plotting, seemed to fall away. They sat together in silence, as they had in youth. One had fought the sea, the other the city. Both had survived. That evening, as dusk fell over the rooftops, Octavian stood by the balcony. The wind carried the smell of grain from the newly opened docks. Below, lamps flickered along the Tiber like small stars returning to a sky that had forgotten them. He thought of Pompey, both father and son of the wheel of time that turned endlessly, grinding names into dust, then raising new ones in their place. The old rivalries had faded, but the sea had taught him something lasting, that victory was not conquest, but endurance. He whispered into the fading light, "Everything comes back, if one waits long enough." The wind answered with a low sigh, not of sorrow, but of peace. For the first time in years, Rome slept without hunger, and in the quiet hum of its breathing, Octavian understood that survival itself could be a kind of grace. Rome was quiet again, but not peaceful. After the storms of war and the hunger of blockade, silence had settled over the city like a blanket too heavy to breathe beneath. The fires were gone, yet the air still smelled faintly of smoke, not from burning buildings, but from burning ambitions. Octavian had learned that sometimes survival depended not on force, but on stillness. He began to move carefully, the way one moves through a room filled with sleeping wolves. Across the sea, Mark Antony ruled the East, proud, flamboyant, adored by soldiers and poets alike. In Rome, Octavian ruled something quieter, fatigue. He had the loyalty of those who were too tired to choose another master. And so began the years of marriages and masks, when every gesture meant two things, and every alliance was a whisper. To ease the tension with Sextus Pompey, the man who had starved Rome, Octavian offered peace, and with it, his sister in marriage. The union was brief, formal, and loveless, more treaty than affection. But Sextus's pride was greater than his hunger. The pact held just long enough for Octavian to breathe again before collapsing into suspicion. The sea was never loyal to land, and neither were men who ruled it. Not long after, Octavian married Scribonia, a woman of noble birth and sharp intelligence. It was a match of necessity, a bridge built to an older faction of Rome's politics. Scribonia was clever enough to understand this, and too proud to pretend otherwise. She bore him a daughter, Julia, on the same day that he sent her a message of divorce. It was not cruelty so much as calculation. Rome's power was no longer built in temples or camps, but in households, and Octavian understood that every union could be a weapon, every bed, a negotiation. Soon after, he turned his eyes toward another Livia Drusilla, already married, already mother to a small child. She was graceful, measured, with a gaze as steady as marble. When Octavian first saw her, it was said he looked as if he were seeing not a woman, but the shape of his own future. He waited only until propriety could be bent, then took her hand. Their wedding was whispered about scandalous, even in a city numb to scandal. But over time, the whispers faded, replaced by the quiet respect reserved for things that endure. Livia became more than wife. She became his mirror, his counsel, the calm presence beside the fever of his ambition. Their household was unlike any other in Rome, silent, ordered, almost austere. While Antony feasted and Sextus plotted at sea, Octavian dined by lamplight, speaking little, listening always. Yet beneath the surface, the chessboard shifted. The alliance with Sextus faltered. Antony's arrogance grew. Lepidus drifted into irrelevance. And the legions, the weary, watchful legions, began to murmur. When Antony and Octavian's armies finally stood across from one another near Brundisium, the soldiers refused to fight. They were done killing Romans for Romans. They sheathed their swords and sat down where they stood, silent, exhausted. In that strange moment, peace was not declared, it simply happened. Neither commander could break men who had already broken themselves. Antony, ever theatrical, proposed a gesture of reconciliation. He would marry Octavia, Octavian's sister, a living bridge between their divided worlds. The wedding was grand, filled with music and applause, but the air around it felt thin, uncertain, like a painting too carefully lit. For a brief while, Rome believed in this peace. Statues were cleaned, temples reopened, markets sang with life again. The people cheered Antony's charm, Octavian's restraint, and the illusion that the Republic still breathed somewhere beneath it all. But in private, Octavian understood better. He had seen how easily vows turned to dust. He smiled, attended ceremonies, played his part, yet every word, every glance was measured. Livia sat beside him through it all, her stillness the quiet anchor of his new order. At night, they would walk through the peristyle garden in silence. The air smelled of wet stone and cypress. Sometimes she would stop and ask, "Do you ever tire of it?" He would answer softly, "Of ruling, never. Of pretending, sometimes." Then they would walk on, past the pools that reflected lamplight like fragments of the moon. Beyond the calm of their home, the world continued to spin in restless patterns. Antony sailed east again toward Egypt, toward Cleopatra, toward the kind of love that was really another kind of power. Sextus, the Sea King, grew reckless. Lepidus clung to relevance, a ghost in the Senate. Through it all, Octavian watched unblinking, patient, letting his rivals exhaust themselves. He no longer needed to fight for control. He simply waited for others to lose it. The marble of Rome cooled under the night air. The streets for once were still. In the shadows, plans unfolded soundlessly. like the quiet turn of a page. This was not the Rome of heroes anymore. It was a Rome of survivors. And in that world, Octavian was learning to rule not by conquest, but by endurance and silence. The city dreamed of peace. He dreamed of permanence. And in the soft half-light of his home, with Livia by his side and the murmur of the Tiber below, he finally began to imagine what both might mean. There were, by now, two Romes, one of marble and discipline, the other of music and perfume. One lived beneath the clear sky of Italy, the other dreamed beneath the gold light of Egypt. And between them stretched the fragile thread of peace, thinner each day, quivering in the wind of ambition. Mark Antony had gone east, and with him went Rome's restless heart. He was a soldier who had once commanded legions like instruments in a symphony, but in Alexandria, he found a stage more intoxicating than any battlefield. There, among lotus pools and silk-draped halls, he met Cleopatra, queen, goddess, and mirror of his own hunger for greatness. She received him not as guest but equal. He had known many women, but none like her, a ruler who could turn affection into diplomacy, laughter into policy. Together, they reinvented monarchy in a city that believed itself older than time. In the great hall of Alexandria, the world seemed remade in color. Musicians played in strange scales. Incense coiled through marble columns. Antony sat on a golden throne beside the Queen of the Nile, his armor exchanged for silk. For a time, the East and West balanced on a single name, love, though what that word meant between empires was uncertain. To Cleopatra, Antony was the Roman who could protect Egypt's crown. To Antony, she was the living symbol of a new order, one ruled not from the Senate but from the stars. Together, they staged what would be called the Donations of Alexandria, a ceremony that divided the known world among their children. Their infant son, Caesarion, born of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, was named King of Kings. Antony's own children were given crowns of Syria, Armenia, and Libya. And at the center of that glittering spectacle, Cleopatra stood draped in gold, hailed as the living Isis. It was theater, yes, but theater with teeth. To Rome, it was a declaration. The East would no longer bow. Back in Rome, Octavian received the news in perfect stillness. He read the reports, folded them once, and said only, "So the play begins." He understood that wars were no longer won by armies alone. They were won by stories. And so, while Antony drowned in incense and applause, Octavian began to weave his own quiet, careful, relentless. His campaign was not waged on fields, but in hearts. He spoke of Antony's abandonment, of Cleopatra's foreign influence, of Rome's dignity being sold for pleasure. He never shouted. He whispered, and Rome listened. Scrolls circulated. Coins were minted, with messages subtle as smoke. In the forums and markets, people began to murmur, "Has Antony forgotten he is Roman?" Women clucked disapproval. Veterans spat on the ground. A moral war had begun, invisible, patient, and far more dangerous than steel. Octavian never attacked directly. He let Antony destroy himself. Every excess in Alexandria, every feast, every jeweled parade became another stone in the wall separating Antony from Rome. He also understood the power of contrast. While Antony played Dionysus, Octavian played Cincinnatus, the simple, dutiful citizen. He appeared in modest clothing, ate plainly, spoke softly of duty and tradition. He made virtue fashionable again. Livia's presence amplified this quiet theater. She was serene, composed a Roman matron in every gesture. When she appeared beside Octavian in public, people saw not opulence, but order. They saw the opposite of Alexandria's indulgence, and they preferred it. Two worlds began to form in the imagination of Rome. One golden, fragrant, and dangerously foreign, the other pale, steady, and reassuring. Two lamps in the dark, one flickering with beauty, one burning with resolve. And yet, beneath that moral calm, Octavian was sharpening every blade of perception. He sent letters to the Senate, always polite, always measured, hinting that Antony planned to move the seat of empire to Alexandria, that Cleopatra desired to make her son, not a Roman, ruler of the world. It was not the truth that mattered, but how it felt. And what Rome began to feel was betrayal. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Antony's laughter grew louder, more desperate. Cleopatra's festivals grew longer, her titles more divine. Together, they tried to drown out the growing echo from the west, the whisper of their own undoing. Antony's friends warned him. He brushed them aside. He had always been the man of the moment, victorious by instinct, doomed by indulgence. But time, that old Roman god, had turned against him. Octavian did not hurry. He sat at his desk by lamplight, reading dispatches, adjusting words, letting the tide of opinion turn grain by grain. To the people, he was patience personified. To his enemies, he was the silence before a storm. Soon, the letters and rumors began to meet in the middle, forming a single story, that Antony was no longer Roman, but servant to a queen, that Rome's armies in the east now knelt before Egypt's throne, that he had traded discipline for decadence, iron for gold, the republic for perfume. It was enough. Rome did not need proof, it needed a reason to remember itself. And so, while one city danced and the other prayed, the world began to tilt. In the east, lamps burned late over marble pools. In the west, candles flickered over wax tablets and sealed decrees. Two cities, two rulers, two visions of Rome, one dreaming, one awake, and somewhere between them, the sea waited dark, wide, patient, ready to decide which light would last. It was a still morning, almost too still for war. The sea off Actium stretched in a long, glassy line blue, turning silver beneath the first light. Ships lay waiting on both sides, their masts unmoving, their sails furled, as if the world itself were holding its breath. After years of words and whispers, everything came down to this. Not a clash of ideas, but of oars and wind. Two lovers and two empires drifting toward their reckoning. Octavian's fleet, built and commanded by Agrippa, had learned from failure. The ships were lighter now, faster, not made to crush, but to endure. They waited like hunters, forming a thin crescent across the gulf, closing off every route but one, the open sea behind Antony and Cleopatra. For weeks, the blockade had starved the enemy fleet. Water turned stale, grain molded, morale thinned like the air before a storm. Antony's soldiers were weary of the east, weary of promises, weary of Cleopatra's gold. They longed for Rome again, for the clean certainty of land. Cleopatra, radiant even in anxiety, stayed aboard her flagship, the Antonia, its hull gilded, its deck heavy with purple sails. She believed, perhaps, that beauty itself could still turn fate. But beauty does not row. The morning wore on, windless, soundless, until at last, oars struck water. Antony's fleet began to move, slow and uncertain, like a body trying to remember how to breathe. From the shore, Octavian watched through the haze. He stood calm, wrapped in his cloak, saying nothing. Beside him, Agrippa gave the quiet signal. Trumpets did not sound, only the low, steady beat of the rowers, like a single vast heart beginning to pulse. At first, the battle unfolded in silence. The ships met like shadows. Rams struck wood, arrows hissed, smoke drifted in thin ribbons across the water. There was no heroism, no roar of victory, only exhaustion made visible. men fighting not for glory but for an ending. Then, through the smoke, a flash of gold, Cleopatra's sails, bright as a sunrise fleeing the world. Her fleet, 60 ships, broke formation and turned south, away from the fight. It was sudden, almost dreamlike. Some said Antony had planned it a retreat to preserve their lives. Others said Cleopatra panicked. That instinct overcame pride. Whatever the reason, when Antony saw her ships pulling away, something inside him broke. He left the line. He turned his galley from the center of battle and rowed after her, abandoning his command, his legions, his war. Behind him, confusion rippled through the ranks. The fleet faltered. Agrippa seized the moment. He closed the crescent, cutting off escape. Firepots arced through the air. Sails burned like falling stars. The sea turned black with ash and red with reflection. By dusk, the Gulf of Actium had become a slow, floating graveyard. Octavian did not exult. He watched the dying light, the oars dipping through the smoke, and said softly, "Enough." He ordered mercy for the survivors, water, bread, shelter. They were Romans after all. When the sea quieted again, the sound that remained was small, the creak of ships, the lap of waves against scorched hulls, the muffled sob of men who had survived what they no longer understood. Far to the south, Antony caught up with Cleopatra's fleeing ship. Witnesses said they met in silence. He looked at her, the woman for whom he had traded a world, and said only, "We have lost Rome." She reached for his hand. Neither spoke again for a long time. In the following days, their scattered fleet limped toward Egypt, chased by shame more than by enemies. Behind them, Actium smoldered not with fire, but with memory. The sea would heal, as it always did, but the names of the fallen would cling to its tides. On the shore, Octavian stood beside Agrippa, the wind tugging softly at his cloak. "Rome is one again," Agrippa said. Octavian nodded, then let her sleep a while, but he knew that peace, like the sea, was never still for long. That night, the campfires along the coast burned low. Sailors cleaned the decks in silence, scraping away tar and blood. In the distance, the waves glimmered faintly silver lines under a darkening sky, like the breath of something vast and dreaming. Octavian walked to the edge of the shore and looked out. The horizon was empty now, no sails, no flame, no sound but the rhythm of water touching stone. He thought of Antony, of how quickly brilliance could become ruin, of Cleopatra, whose beauty had become a kind of exile, of himself, standing here between them, the survivor, the inheritor of silence. A gull called once, circling low, then vanished into the dusk. Octavian turned back toward the tents, where the lamps flickered like cautious stars. The sea whispered behind him, not in triumph, but in relief. And as he walked, it seemed the world, after so many years of war, was finally exhaling one long, weary breath drawn across the dark water of Actium. By the time the sails of Octavian's fleet darkened the horizon of Egypt, summer had settled like dust upon the land. The Nile was low and sluggish, and even the air seemed tired, the kind of stillness that comes when a story is almost done. In Alexandria, the marble palaces shone faintly under the weight of that knowing silence. Antony had returned, worn thin by exile and defeat. The man who once filled amphitheaters with his voice now spoke softly, almost kindly, as if afraid to wake ghosts. Beside him, Cleopatra moved like a shadow of her own legend, graceful still, but dimmed by the inevitability that hung between them. They dined in near silence. Once, their feasts had echoed with music, laughter, the scent of jasmine and wine. Now, the halls held only the sound of sandals on stone and the quiet rustle of silk. Outside, The people waited not in hope, but in the patient fear of those who already know the ending. From the terraces, the sea was visible, calm, endless, and cruelly empty. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Octavian was coming. He no longer needed speed or fire. He was coming the way the tide comes, inevitable, measured, without anger. When his legions reached the desert edge, the sands themselves seemed to hush. Antony tried to rally what was left of his forces, but they were ghosts of an army, hungry, uncertain, weary of both love and loyalty. Many had already defected. The few who remained looked toward the horizon, not with courage, but resignation. At dawn, the battle began. It lasted barely an hour. The defenders crumbled, not from wounds, but from emptiness. When Antony was told that his last commander had surrendered, he nodded slowly, as if confirming a truth he'd already whispered to himself long before. He turned to his servant and said, "Bring me my armor," one last time. But the armor hung loose upon him. He could no longer lift the sword properly. The man who had once terrified the Senate could now barely stand. Still, he mounted his horse and rode through the courtyard, not toward the enemy, but toward memory. Cleopatra watched from the window. When the dust settled, she found him lying near the steps of her mausoleum, breathing faintly. He asked to be carried to her. And so, through corridors heavy with the scent of old incense, they brought the dying Roman to the queen. He took her hand. "You did not betray me," he said softly. "The world simply tired of us." She wept not for him, perhaps, but for the echo of what they had once believed possible. When he died, she closed his eyes herself. Outside, the city was quiet. No mourning drums, no speeches, only the slow gathering of sand across the courtyards, the hush that follows when history has turned a page. When Octavian entered Alexandria, he did so without triumph. No horns, no banners, only a quiet procession of soldiers, their sandals whispering against the stones. He had no need to conquer. The city had already surrendered to exhaustion. Cleopatra waited for him in her tomb, a place she had built years earlier, with walls lined in gold and painted constellations. When Octavian's envoy came to escort her, she received them calmly, veiled in white linen, her voice steady. "Tell your master," she said, "that the Queen of Egypt will not be paraded through his streets." Octavian understood. He had long admired those who chose dignity over spectacle. So when word reached him, hours later, that Cleopatra had ended her life by venom, by design, by will, he did not curse her. He only said, she was never meant to be ruled. Her servants found her lying on a couch of gold, the faint scent of myrrh in the air, a small mark upon her arm. 2 handmaidens wept beside her, one already dead, one dying. The asp was gone. Only silence remained. In the following days, Octavian ordered that she be buried beside Antony not as enemies, but as two who had once shared a single, terrible dream. He spared her attendants, restored calm to the city, and walked its halls alone at dusk. He paused at a window overlooking the harbor, the same view Cleopatra had once shown to Julius Caesar, and later to Antony. The water was still. 3 rulers, he murmured, and the sea outlives us all. A messenger arrived soon after. Caesarion, the young son of Cleopatra and Caesar, had been captured while fleeing south. Octavian hesitated. He thought of the boy's face, the shadow of the man he might become another claimant to another Rome. Then, quietly, he said, "No more kings of kings." The order was carried out without spectacle. History absorbed the silence. With that, resistance ended. The banners of Egypt fell not with sound, but with the faint sigh of silk in the wind. And so Octavian, not yet Augustus, stood on the balcony of the royal palace and looked out over the Nile. its waters glinting like molten glass. He had conquered the world, and the world for the moment was still. In the streets below, children played again. The city, as cities always do, began to forget. Sand drifted over the tracks of the soldiers, covering the footprints that had led here from so far away. The empire would rise from this dust, but for now, there was only quiet. A quiet so vast it seemed to cradle the whole horizon. Octavian closed his eyes. He thought not of glory, but of rest, the strange rest that comes when there are no more enemies left to name. Above him, the desert wind moved softly, carrying away the last whispers of Antony and Cleopatra, a pair of voices lost to time, fading like perfume in the heat. Morning returned to Rome gently, after years of thunder. The wars were over, the gates no longer watched by sleepless guards, and yet the city moved with the careful rhythm of someone relearning peace. At the heart of it all stood Octavian, no longer a boy, not quite yet a god. He was 36, pale from travel, his health still fragile, but his eyes were calm, the eyes of someone who had waited too long to be surprised by victory. It was 27 BC, the year the Republic exhaled its last breath, and the empire quietly began to breathe. No trumpet marked the moment. No proclamation shouted it to the heavens. It came softly, like dawn mist turning to light. The Senate met in solemn ceremony. The marble walls still echoed faintly with the ghosts of Cicero and Caesar, of debates once fiery enough to shake the pillars. Now, the men spoke slowly, almost reverently. They returned power to Octavian, or so it seemed. He stood before them, modest in posture, draped not in armor, but in white. He spoke of weariness, of wanting only rest, of serving Rome's peace rather than its politics. And in that gesture of humility, he received everything he had ever sought. The Senate pleaded for him to stay, to continue as leader, not as dictator, not as king, but something softer, something more permanent. They gave him a new name, Augustus, the revered one, a title neither royal nor republican, but something that lived between. It was a kind of poetry, Rome, weary of chaos, crowning a man who pretended not to want the crown. And so, without blood or storm, the Republic ended. Outside, the city carried on as if nothing had changed. Children played near the forum. Merchants called from their stalls. The air smelled of olive oil and wet stone. But beneath the noise, something had shifted, a new stillness at the core of power, a slow and steady heartbeat where once there had been shouting. Augustus, the first among citizens, began to rebuild, not through decree, but through rhythm. He knew that Rome did not need new gods, it needed time to believe in itself again. He restored temples, repaired aqueducts, sent laborers to mend the crumbling roads. He reduced the size of the army, set veterans upon land, and created what had never truly existed before, a government that could outlive the man who built it. But the price of peace was solitude. Even surrounded by senators, by family, by the ever-present Livia, Augustus lived apart like a man listening to music no one else could hear. His health faltered. Letters from his physicians described fevers, long nights of shivering, months spent in quiet recovery. When he could travel again, he went west to Gaul and Hispania, the provinces that had once been battlegrounds. He moved slowly through their hills and towns, not as conqueror, but as caretaker. Everywhere he went, he left something behind: a repaired road, a decree of amnesty, a monument to order. The people cheered him not out of passion, but relief. In the evenings, he would sit at the edge of his camp and watch the sky fade, the same pale fire that had once watched over Caesar, over Pompey, over the nameless dead. He said to a companion once, "Rome is not built of stone, but of breath. It survives when men stop shouting. Sometimes he would wake before dawn, walk among the tents, and listen to the soldiers breathing in sleep, that soft, fragile music of a world at rest. Back in Rome, rumors swirled about succession, ambition, conspiracy. The city could never entirely forget its taste for drama, but for the moment, all such noise seemed distant. What lingered was quiet, the slow unfurling of an empire learning how to last. When he returned to Rome after months abroad, the people came out to meet him, not as they had met victors before, not with roses, not with trumpets, but with gentle applause, the sound of gratitude more than adoration. They lined the streets, calling his name softly, as if afraid to wake something still healing. Augustus raised his hand, not in command, but in peace. He walked among them, thinner than before, his steps careful, his expression unreadable. Later that night, from his balcony, he looked over the dark roofs of Rome. The lamps of the city twinkled like fallen stars. He thought of how far he had come from the frail boy in his grandmother's house to the ruler of all he could see. He felt no triumph, only an immense, weightless calm. Livia came to stand beside him. "You've given them peace," she said. "For now," he replied. "Peace is only a kind of waiting." She touched his hand, and they watched the city together, a city that no longer burned, but glowed. Below, the Tiber shimmered, reflecting the moon in its patient current. Above, the first hour of a new age drifted quietly into being. There were no victories left to win, no rivals left to fear, only the long work of time, and the hope that this stillness might endure longer than the man who made it. So began the reign of Augustus, not with a coronation, but with a breath, not with thunder, but with morning. And as the sun rose over the marble city, Rome reborn and weary finally learned how to stand still. Peace, when it finally came, was not a statue but a workshop. Rome was no longer building empires, it was learning to maintain them. In the quiet years of Augustus, the city filled with sound again, not of war, but of chisels, hammers, and the murmuring rhythm of ordinary work. From the Palatine Hill, smoke curled from forges. New marble rose where ruins had been. The emperor would sometimes walk among the builders at dawn, touching the cool stone with a craftsman's patience. He once said, "I found Rome built of brick. I leave her clothed in marble." It was not boasting, but a prayer, a promise to turn chaos into permanence. And yet, marble was only the surface. Beneath it, Augustus was shaping something more delicate, the machinery of order. He created a civil service to keep the city alive. Record keepers, judges, road surveyors, grain distributors. He organized taxation, not as punishment, but as balance, an invisible current moving bread and silver from one end of the empire to the other. He established postal routes, new harbors, a standing navy to guard the Mediterranean, now called Mare Nostrum, our sea. He offered pensions to soldiers, so they could age with dignity rather than rebellion. For the first time, Rome became more than a conquest, it became a system. The people, long accustomed to fear, learned new habits, to trust, to plan, to grow old. Markets stabilized, roads reached further north and west. Stone milestones marked the distance to Rome, each one a heartbeat in the vast arterial network of empire. And yet, as always, there was shadow beneath the marble. Augustus, the patient craftsman, could not resist sculpting morals as well as laws. He passed legislation on marriage, urging Romans to wed, to bear children, to live as the ancestors once had. He punished adultery, even among the elite, but in trying to make virtue permanent, he made it brittle. The same man who once spoke softly of moderation now carried lists of offenders, senators, poets, even family. When his own daughter, Julia, was accused of infidelity. He could not protect her. He exiled her to a barren island, alone with the sound of the waves. Those who had once cheered his reforms now whispered that marble too could crack. Still, the work continued. Rome became a living mechanism of peace grain flowing from Egypt, ships docking from Spain, traders from Gaul and Syria meeting under arches that bore his name. He built libraries, forums, and temples not for himself, but for the idea of Rome as eternal caretaker of civilization. Everywhere, there were signs of renewal lamps lit in clean streets, fire brigades ready with water buckets, guards patrolling the alleys. The air was different now, disciplined, breathable, alive. In the evenings, Augustus would retreat to his study. He wrote letters to governors, reviewed laws, and stared at maps that showed the empire like a sleeping body, vast and vulnerable. He understood that order, like art, must be tended daily, or it begins to decay. He once told Agrippa, long before his friend's death, "Peace is not stillness, it is the slow labor of keeping stillness alive." And so he worked slowly, constantly, never fully resting. But even as he built his Rome, the old world kept reminding him of its cost. In 9 AD, word reached him from the forests of Germania, a place of endless mist and whispering pines. 3 Roman legions under Varus had marched into the Teutoburg forest and never returned. The messenger trembled as he spoke. The ambush had been complete, tens of thousands dead, eagles captured, names erased into mud and pine needles. When Augustus heard it, he did not speak. He stood, staring at the floor. That night, his servants found him pacing the halls, whispering over and over, "Varus, give me back my legions." He tore at his hair, broke sleep with long silences, and for weeks refused music or ceremony. To the people, he showed composure, but to those closest to him, the mask had cracks, because he knew what it meant. Not just the loss of men, but the reminder that marble could not reach the edge of the world. For the first time in years, Augustus looked not like a god, but like a man. He aged more in those months than in the previous decade. He began to understand that peace, too, has its limits, that no wall, no reform, no decree could protect the empire from the weather of time. Still, each morning, he returned to his desk. He signed edicts, approved bridges, revised laws. He watched the masons polish marble until it gleamed again. He wrote to his stepson Tiberius, sending him back to Germania not for vengeance, but for order. And at night, when the torches dimmed, he would sit by a small lamp, staring at the light on his hands. They were the hands of a craftsman, veined, scarred, patient. He had built something immense, but never perfect. Something beautiful, but never without shadow. He once told Livia quietly, "Even gods must learn to rest." She smiled, but said nothing. Outside, the city he had rebuilt breathed in its sleep fountains, murmuring, guards pacing, distant hoofbeats echoing down clean, moonlit streets. Rome had become his masterpiece, not for its glory, but for its endurance. And somewhere beyond the Tiber, in the dark workshop of history, the craftsman of peace kept shaping the night, steady, careful, human. The years began to fold quietly, like pages pressed shut by tired hands. The empire had learned its rhythm, the city its breath. And Augustus, now older, thinner, gentler in his silences, moved through his days like a man untying a long thread slowly, carefully, never wanting it to end, but knowing it must. There was no more conquest left to claim, no storm left to calm. What remained was the slow work of leaving. His circle had grown smaller. Agrippa, the loyal friend who had once steadied every victory, was gone. He had fallen ill in the Balkans, and though messengers rode hard to bring him home, death arrived first. When Augustus saw the body, he wept without shame. They said he rode beside the coffin all the way back to Rome, the torches flickering like old memories, until the mausoleum doors closed. A lifetime of companionship sealed into marble. He buried him there in the very tomb Augustus had built for himself, and perhaps in doing so, he buried the last piece of his youth. Then came the sons. First Drusus, broken by a fall from his horse. Then Gaius and Lucius, the grandsons he had cherished like sunrise, both gone before their time. One fell to illness, the other to a wound that would not heal. Their names were carved into stone, while Augustus still breathed the cruelest order of all. He had built an empire meant to outlast men, and yet men were the frailest of its walls. Each loss hollowed him further. Even Julia, his bright, spirited daughter, whom he had exiled for her sins, now lived in isolation. He never brought her back. He spoke of her only once in public, voice steady, eyes distant. The laws I made were not only for others. Rome admired his justice, but history heard the quiet cost beneath it. In these years, the city glowed, but its emperor dimmed. He rarely appeared in triumph. Instead, he worked from a lamplit desk, rewriting laws, letters, fragments of thought. He began composing the Res Gestae, the deeds of the divine Augustus, a list of what he had done, as if to leave behind not pride, but clarity. The sentences were simple, almost shy. I found Rome a city of brick. I leave it a city of marble. He meant not the walls, but the spirit, the transformation from ruin to rhythm, from fear to form. Marble was his metaphor for endurance. Around him, the new generation circled. Tiberius, his stepson, had left Rome once in bitterness, retreating to Rhodes. Augustus had begged him to return, for there was no one else. And after years of exile, Tiberius did reluctant, colder, more deliberate than ever. The city did not love him, but Augustus trusted necessity more than affection. He adopted him at last, the old man's hand trembling slightly as he signed. Even that, history would remember not as triumph, but as resignation. The days passed in a soft, perpetual twilight. He spent them writing, walking, sitting by Livia's side, as the air outside grew heavy with summer. Sometimes they would read together in the garden old poems, letters from vanished friends, news from distant provinces. Sometimes they simply watched the light fade across the marble he had once promised to the city. When illness came again, it was almost gentle. He withdrew to his villa near Nola, beneath the shadow of Vesuvius. The mountain was quiet then, sleeping under its veil of mist. He spent his mornings listening to the servants tending olive trees, the sound of pruning shears cutting softly like a metronome for his final thoughts. He spoke less, and when he did, it was with the measured calm of one who has rehearsed farewell. He told Livia, "I have played my part well. If I have pleased you and the world, then applaud." M3. It was half jest, half truth, the curtain call of a life, lived entirely on history's stage. For days he drifted in and out of sleep. Outside, the cicadas sang. Inside, cool linen sheets whispered as he turned. A few attendants kept watch, reading quietly to fill the silence. Then, one afternoon, as the air shimmered gold with the heat, he opened his eyes for the last time. He looked toward the window, where light touched the floor in a single bright square, and smiled. A breath left him not heavy, but soft, as if exhaled into eternity. Augustus died at Nola, August 19th, 14 AD. He was 76. Rome mourned him with the solemnity of habit. Yet beneath the rituals there was something else, a strange stillness, a shared exhale. They had feared him, followed him, grown old beneath his rule. Now they stood in a peace so complete it felt foreign. The body was borne back to the capital through towns that had never known war, past roads he had ordered paved, over bridges he had decreed. At every stop, citizens gathered, not wailing, but silent, as if watching the closing of a great book. When the urn was placed beside Agrippa's, the marble gleamed faintly in torchlight, and the city, for a breath, seemed to hold still with him. He had not been perfect. He had been patient. He had not been divine, but he had taught a restless world to sleep again. His Rome would outlive him for centuries, sometimes cruel, sometimes glorious, but always bound by the rhythm he had taught it. That endurance is its own kind of mercy. And so the long goodbye became light, a glow that stayed on the stones, on the river, on the faces of those who no longer feared tomorrow. In the end, his greatest act was not in ruling, but in letting go. And when he did, Rome remained breathing, still, luminous in the afterglow. And now, the story quiets. The names, the empires, the fires all fade into the hush of time. What remains is only breath and the soft turning of the world beneath it. You don't need to remember the dates or the faces, just the feeling that even the loudest lives become gentle in the end. Let that thought rest with you tonight. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. The music will stay for a while, carrying you softly through what's left of the night. You are safe. The story is over. Now, only calm remains. Good night.